or the rogue character was a character which, let's say, went on different errands, went on, let's say, adventures from one place to the other.
Right.
And at the same time, it's the story of their adventures, and with their adventure, the story moves forward.
Right. And picaresque word comes from let's look at the slide. The picaresque novel. The picaro is Spanish word for rogue, and the typical picaresque story is of the escapades of a rascal, as you rightly pointed out, who lives by his wits. So what we have here is that knights being replaced by rascals, and this shift actually indicates the outlook which has changed from anthropocentric, more idealized worldview of Renaissance that you have to more human, more realistic way of looking at life, and that's why rascal becomes the central character, replacing the knight. So that the whole outlook towards life seems to have changed, and how this shift in outlook has given rise to new literary form. The development of the realistic novel owes much to the such works, which were written to deflate romantic or idealized fictional form. So fictional forms which dealt with romance, the idealization of bravery of knights and their glory and their great adventures and heroism were replaced by people who were actually rascals or non-heroic or anti-heroic. And we have at this juncture a very important novel, Anil, by Cervantes that we are going to discuss now. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we look at a very important picaresque novel called Don Quixote. Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, is the story of engaging madman who tries to live by the ideals of chivalric romance, explores the role of illusion and reality in life, and was one of the single most important progenitors of modern novel. Don Quixote's story is one of the very important precursors to modern novel, because in some way it is a novel, as you said, about the novel, and how the main character is actually addicted to reading chivalric romances, and he feels that he is also a knight while he is just a commoner, and the whole chivalry, institution of chivalry, is no more. So he is actually anachronistic. He lives out of his times. He feels that there are still adventures waiting for him, and there is still this chivalry waiting for him. So Don Quixote goes out for his adventures or misadventures, and very interesting misadventure is when he thinks that the windmill is actually a demon, and so he tries to actually kill the windmill, and so this gives rise to the phrase called tilting at the windmills, where you fight the imaginary demon. So modern man, unlike the pre-modern man, is fighting imaginary demons all the time, and this is what Don Quixote's misadventures seems to point out.
Again, very important thing in this novel, Sachin, could be that the protagonist comes out of the novel and becomes the character himself, or tries to imagine that he is the character, and he probably becomes the knight or the, let's say, person who goes on these misadventures, as you say, but the entire edifice of the novel again falls, just as you find in modern novels, where the entire edifice of the novel towards the end many a times falls on itself. Here again, towards the end, he says that nobody will read any more novels now. The novel here ends with that sort of a suggestion, where he says that now I won't be reading any novel now, because that novel makes the reader identify with the protagonist to such an extent that he may go on to those misadventures, which here it very clearly, let's say, points out. Whereas in the short story, as you had earlier said, it's more about the total impression or the total impact, and it's less about identifying with the character, it's more about identifying with the incidents, more about identifying with the story and its progression. That's the main difference between the two.
Right, very right. So let's move further, and let's look at the history of novel in closer detail. The novel is often said to have emerged with the appearance of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in 1719 and Moll Flanders in 1722. The first novel of character or psychological novel is Samuel Richardson's Pamela, 1740 to 41, an epistolatory novel, a novel in which the story is conveyed entirely by the exchange of letters. It's a very popular device that you find in so many novels. A letter is seen to advance the story. It is the work characterized by the careful plotting of emotional states. Another such important work is Richardson's masterpiece Clarissa, What you see, Anil, is that adventures seem to have moved inside. It's no longer the knight's adventures in the world out there, but what is going on in here seems to be the focus of what is known as psychological novel, or the novel of character, as it's said. And the term epistolatory also is a very important term for the students of literature, because as a term it's often asked in exam, what is epistolatory novel, where the novel is actually using letter as a kind of device to advance the plot.
Again, as you said very rightly, that here the, let's say, action moves from the physical action to the psychological action.
Right.
Whereas it's not an errand in the outside world. It's more of an errand inward.
Exactly.
Psychologically, what let's say character thinks. Another thing that the students might find very interesting, maybe that Samuel Richardson owned a printing press, and he wanted to, let's say, tell his audience or the people in England as to how they should write good letters. This was the time when, let's say, the mail service had started, the postal service had started, and in England, and he actually wanted to tell them or write a book about how to write good letters. He started with that, and then he thought that he would need some characters who will be writing letters to some other character. And as it developed, it became the first English novel or the first English psychological novel. Right. And many people even say that Samuel Richardson is the father of English novel, right, in that sense. Right. But again, students should see that the psychological novel started with Samuel Richardson, right, but even before him, there have been, let's say, books or works that come very close to the definition of the novel.
Yes, we saw Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe. We can also think of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan.
Oh, yes.
Or we can also think of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift as early precursors of the novel. So let's move ahead. And let's look at a very important theorist of novel, and whom we are going to contrast with Frank O'Connor's discussion that we had about the lonely voice. Yes. And this theorist is the Russian theorist and a philosopher known Mikhail Bakhtin. And what he has to say about the novel. Mikhail Bakhtin, 1895 to 1975, was a Russian philosopher, literary critic and scholar who worked on literary theory, ethics and philosophy of language. So this is the picture of very important theorist of novel called Mikhail Bakhtin. So let's have a look what he has to say about the novel.
In epic and novel, Bakhtin points out the novel's distinct nature by contrasting it with the epic. He shows that the novel is well suited to the post-industrial civilization in which we live because it flourishes on diversity. It is the same diversity that the epic attempts to eliminate from the world. A very, let's say, important definition, which tells us about the methodology that the two different forms use. If you look at the epic looks at the world in a more uniform sort of a way. Whereas in an epic, it's generally, let's say, the conflict between the good and the bad. And you could be either with the good or the bad. There is no gray area or patch that, let's say, you have. It is either you are white or black. There can't be anything gray. Whereas when you're talking about the novel is multi-dimensional in that way. And it gives a legroom to, let's say, various views or various sorts of people within the society. It does not only talk about two types of people or two types of ideologies. That is the good or the bad, which you find in most of the epics.
Right. So very interestingly, Anil, is here Bakhtin is comparing novel with epic. Both of these are narrative forms of extended length. Epic often relies on verse and novel often relies on prose, though it's not necessary that novel is always in prose. You have exceptions like Vikram Sheth's novel, Golden Gate, which is written in a sonnet form. But even then, the novel can be contrasted fruitfully with epic. And what you find is that, as you rightly pointed out, that epic is about synthesis of black versus white, right versus wrong. It's the uniform, the totalizing impact of epic. While novel deals with the in-between, good and a bad, right and a wrong. So it gives rise to multi-dimensional perspectives and multiple voices that Bakhtin will discuss, and that's what he means by diversity. Let's look at his discussion in greater detail. Bakhtin on the novel says that the novel as a genre is unique in that it is able to embrace, ingest and devour other genres while still maintaining its status as a novel. The other genres, however, cannot emulate the novel without damaging their own distinctive identity. This is a very interesting insight. Novel is seen as something which eats up other forms, like short story, like epic, like poetry, like all other literary drama. Novel seems to consume, eat, ingest, digest multiple forms without losing its identity, because probably it has no identity. But at the same time, short story cannot do the same.
Oh yes.
Drama cannot do what novel is doing. So novel's distinctiveness lies in its ability to eat up other forms. That is what Bakhtin is saying.
The example that you gave from Vikram Seth is one of the examples how, let's say, the verse form was used in, let's say, a novel, as a novel. So again, you see that it has eaten up or taken or imbibed or, let's say, gulped down, swallowed, let's say, the verse form or the poetry form.
Right.
Again, you could use poetic language in, let's say, a novel. You could use the dialogue format in a novel. But then in a drama, you cannot, let's say, have extended narration.
Exactly.
Again, in poetry, you cannot use extended, let's say, prose. There are prose, let's say, poems, which are more prosaic. You have a poet with us here. But then at the same time, let's say, novel has emerged and developed primarily because it has, let's say, engulfed all the forms that have come its way. Exactly. And it has changed and evolved with all those forms. And that is why the novel that we had at the earliest time and the novel that we have today have some things in common, and they are still very far apart and very different from each other.
Right. So this tendency of the novel is a form to eat up other forms, gobble up other forms. The version, as you pointed out, was Vikram Seth's, but the earliest version of poetic novels or novel in verse was Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. It's a Russian novel. I don't know how to exactly pronounce it, but Pushkin's novel is written in a words format. So novel seems to be eating up everything that comes within its reach, and at the same time remain a novel. So it seems to be a huge bag, as somebody defined, that where you can put in anything that you want to put in.
Even Canterbury Tales by Chaucer can be called as, let's say, verse narratives, because they narrate a story.
Right.
Though technically they do not come very close to the novel as you see it in that sense. But then there have been novels written which can be divided into various parts. Right. And if you, let's say, see the progression of all these stories, and if you combine all of them, compile all of them, you have, let's say, various voices of the 14th century that you can see in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Right. And it's a, let's say, narrative in the verse format.
Right. So talking of voices that you might point out, let's see what Bakhtin has to say about this. And he uses the term, let's look at the next slide, where he uses the very important term heteroglossia. In this slide, heteroglossia means any language in Bakhtin's view stratifies into many voices. What do you say, Anil? Multiple voices. The social dialects, characteristic group behavior, professional jargons like that of doctor or engineer or lawyer, generic languages, languages of generations and age groups like slang on the street, tendentious languages, languages of the authorities of various cycles and passing fashion. So within a language you have many languages, and this multiple language within a language is what Bakhtin means by heteroglossia, having many languages within a language. And he is talking about diversity in language, Vaividya, Bhasha Vaividya, variety of language that he means. This is the heterogeneous language of language, what Bakhtin calls heteroglossia. Glossia means tongue, hetero means multiple. So within a language you have many languages, and this is what novel seems to be addressing here. So Bakhtin says the linguistic energy of the novel is in its expression of the conflict between voices through their adaptation to different elements in the novel's discourse. This diversity of voice is the defining characteristic of novel as a genre. So novel seems to be not just eating up many forms, it's also about multiple forms of language, many genres of language, what Bakhtin calls speech genres. So many genres are actually encompassed or devoured by the novel, and that is what gives it its energy.
That's what makes it multidimensional.
Right. So let's now towards the end compare and contrast the novel and short story as form. As both the forms are prose narrative, the basic elements of narrative like characterization, plot, points of view, and setting are common. However, comparing Bakhtin's view on novel and Frank O'Connor's and Boyd's views on the short story, we realize that difference between short story and the novel is not simply the length of the story. So short story is not a novel cut in short, nor is novel an extension of short story, but these two are two different formats, and though they use the basic elements like characterization, plot, point of view, they are primarily not similar, they are different. And the overall emphasis and the focus of short story seems to be towards the individual and his or her isolation, as Connor points out in The Lonely Voice. And the overall emphasis and the focus of the novel seems to be on the plurality and social diversity of conflicting voice. What you say is multidimensionality of society is what novel, the energy of novel comes from. So this is a very interesting and fruitful way of distinguishing these two. Let's have a look at Boyd and what he says about this distinction. As a writer and as a theorist, he says that something occurs in writing and reading of a short story that is of another level from reading and writing a novel. The basic issue, as you, Anil, pointed out earlier, is that of compression versus expansion. We see that the ideas, the inspiration, that the will drive a novel, however succinctly expressed, have to be capable of endless augmentation and elaboration. There is this centrifugal element in the novel which goes away from the center, and there is centripetal movement in the short story where there is a movement towards the center.
In order to make it more clearer to the students, we could say that a novelist keeps on adding something to the story in order to, let's say, lengthen it, in order to take it, let's say, further. Right. Whereas a short story writer keeps on extracting those things which a short story can do without. Right. So anything that is not necessary for the story should not be a part of the story. Right. Whereas in a novel, a novelist can, let's say, go on describing a scene or, let's say, nature for 2 pages, 3 pages. Whereas, let's say, a novelist does not have that leisure or that, let's say, facility or that faculty.
Right. What do you say of that 2 pennies? And that you have in your pocket, and a short story writer won't spend the next one if it's possible by one. And this is the picture of William Boyd, a very important Scottish novelist and screenwriter whom we have discussed. And what he says as essence of almost all stories is one of distillation and of reduction. As you said, distillation is a very important word. It's not a simple question of length. There are 20 pages short stories, and there are far more charge and brevity than 400 pages novel. He says we are talking about